Chapter 20. B is for Brigid. Brigid had 2 looms now, and would soon be ready for a third. She stood between them proudly, the sweat pouring from her forehead in concentration. If she would wear less clothing. But no, the girls from the acre wore the same layers of dress, summer and winter. Still, despite her craziness, Brigid was turning into a proper operative. Mr. Marsden hardly came past Lyddie's looms these days. When their eyes met by chance, it was as though they had never been introduced. Earlier, his coldness had worried her. She feared then that he might find some reason to dismiss her, so she had been scrupulous to observe every regulation to the letter. As the days went on, she became less anxious about Mr. Marsden's state of mind, much preferring his coolness to the rosebud smiles and little pats she had endured before her illness. She treated herself to some more books. In honor of Ezekiel Freeman, what a handsome name her friend had chosen for himself, she bought Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave written by himself, and a Bible. Both volumes became a quiet comfort to her Sunday loneliness, because as she read them she could hear Ezekiel's rich, warm voice filling the darkness of the cabin. She had liked Mr. Dickens' account of his travels in America, all but the Lowell part. It was, as Diana had warned her, romantical. There was no mention in its rosy descriptions of sick lungs or blacklisting or men with wives and conquered. July wore on its weary way into August. It seemed a century since the summer just a year ago when she had read and reread Oliver Twist and dreamed of home. She had been such a child then, such a foolish, unknowing child. As always, many of the New England operatives had gone home. Brigid took on her third loom. More Irish girls came on as spare hands. Some of the machines simply stood idle. The room was quieter. Lyddie took to copying out passages from Mr. Douglass and the Bible to paste on her looms. She liked the Psalms best. I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, and by the rivers of Babylon there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. The Psalms were poetry. No, songs that rode the powerful rhythm of the looms. Sometimes she composed her own. By the rivers of Merrimack and Concord, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered. I must forget, she thought. I must forget them all. I cannot bear the remembering. Lyddie was strong again. Her body no longer betrayed her into exhaustion by the end of the day, and she was past shedding tears for what might have been. It was a relief, she told herself, not to carry the burden of debt or, what was worse, the welfare of other persons. A great yoke had been lifted from her shoulders, had it not? And someday the stone would be taken from her breast as well. Between them, she and Brigid coached several of the new spare hands, all of them wearing far too much clothing in the suffocating heat. But me mother says me capes will kape me cool, one of the girls insisted. Lyddie let it be. She hadn't managed to persuade Brigid to take off her silly capes. How could she expect to persuade the new girls? Still, she was more patient with them than she had ever been with poor Brigid at the beginning. She had to be. Brigid herself was a paragon of gentleness, teaching the new girls all that Lyddie and Diana had taught her, never raising her voice in irritation or complaint. Lyddie watched her snip off a length of thread from the bobbin and lead one of the clumsier girls over to the window and show her in the best light how to tie a weaver's knot. It was exactly what Lyddie remembered doing, but she knew, to her shame, that her own face had betrayed exasperation, while Brigid's was as gentle as that of a ewe nuzzling her lamb. She smiled ruefully at Brigid as the girl returned to her own looms. Brigid smiled back broadly. She's a bit slow, that one. We're all allowed to be fools the first week or two, she said, hearing Diana's voice in her head. There had been a short note from Diana telling her not to worry, that she had found a place in a seamstress's shop. But how could she not be anxious for her? Aye, Brigid was continuing sadly, but I'm a fool yet. She nodded at the psalm pasted on Lyddie's loom. And you such a scholar. Lyddie slid her fingers under the paper to loosen the paste and handed it to Brigid. Here, she said, for practice. I'll make another for myself. Brigid shook her head. It will do me no good. I might as well be blind, you know. But I sent you a note once. I took it straight away to Diana to read to me. You've learned your letters, at least. Shamefaced, the girl shook her head. Lyddie sighed. She couldn't take Brigid on to teach, but how could she begrudge her a chance to start? She made papers for the girl to post. A is for agent. Beside it was a crude picture of a man in a beaver hat, the stern high priest of those invisible Boston gods who'd created the corporations and to whom all in Lowell daily sacrificed their lives. B is for Bobbin, and Brigid, too. B was instantly mastered. C is for carding. D is for drawing in. She went on, using as far as possible words Brigid knew from factory life. Each day, Lyddie gave her 3 new papers to post and learn, and at the end of the day to take home and practice. So it was that day by day, without intending to be, Lyddie found herself bound letter by letter, word by word, sentence by sentence, page by page, until it was, come by when you've had your supper and we'll work on the reader together. Or on a Sunday afternoon, meet me by the river and I'll bring paper and pens for practice. She did not go to Brigid's house. She was not afraid to go into the acre. She was not frightened by rumors of robberies and assaults, but somehow she was reluctant to go for Brigid's sake. She did not want Brigid to have to be ashamed of the only home she had. At last a letter came from Charlie. She had not allowed herself to look for one, but when it came she realized how she had longed to hear, just to be reminded that she had not been altogether forgotten. Dear Sister Lyddie, Charlie did make his letters well. We are fine. We hope you are well too. Rachel began school last month. Her cough is nearly gone, and she is growing quite fat with Mrs. Finney's cooking. Luke Stevens says he has had no reply. Do think kindly on him, Lyddie. You need someone to watch out for you as well. Your loving brother, Charles Worthen. She almost tore this letter up, but stopped at the first tear. She had nearly ripped the page across Charlie's name. September came. Some of the New England girls had returned to the weaving room, though the room was now mostly Irish. No Diana, of course, though there was something in Lyddie that kept waiting for her, that kept expecting to see the tall, quiet form moving toward her through the lint-filled room. She had taken something from the weaving floor with her going. There was no quiet center left in the tumult. A letter arrived in September on thick, expensive paper, the address decked out in curlicues. We regret to inform you of the death of Maggie M. Worthen. They hadn't even gotten her name right. Poor Mama. Nothing ever right for her in life or death. Lyddie squeezed her eyes closed and tried to picture her mother's face. She could see the thin, restless form rocking back and forth before the fire, the hair already streaked with gray. But the face was blurred. She had been gone so long from them, gone long before she died. Fall came. Not the raucous patchwork of the Green Mountains, but the sedate brocade of a Massachusetts city. The days began to shorten. Lyddie went to work in darkness and came back to supper in darkness. The whale oil lamps stayed on nearly the whole day in the factory, so water buckets were kept filled on every floor. Fire was a constant dread while the lamps burned. As the days grew short, breakfast came before the working day began. There was, as always, barely time to swallow the meals. though the food was not as ample as it had been a year ago. At the end of the day now she waited for Brigid, and they would go out together. Often all the other girls passed them on the stairs or in the yard, for they would be talking about what Brigid had read since the day before, and Lyddie would solve the mystery of an impossible word, or the conundrum of a sentence. Then one evening she realized that Brigid was not beside her on the crowded stairs. She tried to wait, but the crowd of chattering operatives pushed her forward. She went down to the bottom of the stairs and stepped out of the stream. 100 or more girls went past. She was puzzled. Surely Brigid had been right beside her. They'd been talking. Brigid had asked her what thraldom was. She was trying laboriously to read Mr. Douglas's book, but was yet to get through the first page of the preface. At last the stairs were empty of clattering feet, and the shrill laughter of young women at the end of a long workday. But still there was no Brigid. Lyddie hesitated. Perhaps the girl had gone ahead. Or perhaps she had forgotten something and gone back. Lyddie started across the nearly deserted yard. Her supper would be waiting, and Mrs. Bedloe was insulted by tardiness. She had got nearly to the gate when something made her stop, nose up, like a doe with young in the thicket. She hurried back and climbed the 4 flights to the weaving room. The lamps had been extinguished by the operatives as they left their looms, so at first her eyes could make out nothing but the hulking shapes of the machines. Then she heard a strained, high-pitched voice. "Please, sir, please, Mr. Marsden." Lyddie snatched up the fire bucket. It was full of water, but she did not notice the weight. "Please, no!" She ran down the aisle between the looms toward the voice, and saw in the shadows Brigid, eyes white with fear, and Mr. Marsden's back. His hands were clamped on Brigid's arms. "Mr. Marsden!" At the sound of her hoarse cry, the overseer whirled about. She crammed the fire bucket down over his shiny pate, his bulging eyes, his rosebud mouth fixed in a perfect little O. The stagnant water sloshed over his shoulders and ran down his trousers. She let go of the bucket and grabbed Brigid's hand. They began to run, Lyddie dragging Brigid across the floor. Behind, in the darkness, she thought she heard the noise of an angry bear crashing an oatmeal pot against the furniture. She started to laugh. By the time they were at the bottom of the stairs, she was weak with laughter and her side ached, but she kept running through the empty yard, past the startled gatekeeper, across the bridge, and down the row of wide-eyed boarding houses, dragging a bewildered Brigid behind her.